The pencil trembled in the young pilot's hand as he wrote by the dim glow of a kerosene lamp, the paper resting on his knee inside a bamboo hut near Kanoya Airfield, Kyushu. Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and salt from the East China Sea, but also something else, the quiet dread of men who knew they would not return. It was April 10, 1945. Lieutenant Kenji Takahashi was 21 years old. In 3 days, he would climb into the cockpit of a Mitsubishi A6M0, strap a 550-pound bomb to its belly, and fly toward the American fleet off Okinawa with no intention of coming back. He had been trained to believe his death would be divine, a final act of purity that would pierce the heart of the enemy and turn the tide of the war. But in the silence of that night, doubt crept in like fog. Not doubt in his duty, never that, but doubt in whether his sacrifice would even matter. He wrote, "They say the Americans are soft, decadent, unprepared for true spirit, but from the skies over Leyte, I saw something else. Their ships do not sleep. Their guns do not wait. Even in darkness they see us coming." He paused, then added the words that would later be found folded inside his flight log after the war. "Even death couldn't reach U.S. ships. Their radar saw us coming." Kenji was not alone in this realization. By the spring of 1945, hundreds of young Japanese pilots had begun to understand the terrible truth. Japan's last weapon, spiritual sacrifice, had already been neutralized by an invisible American shield. Not courage, not numbers, but technology so advanced it turned the sky itself into an extension of the American mind. The story of the Kamikaze is often told as one of fanaticism and despair, but through the eyes of those who flew the missions, it becomes something else entirely. A collision between myth and machinery, between the ancient belief in transcendent death and the cold, calculating precision of American science. And in that collision, the Pacific War revealed its final verdict. No amount of will could overcome a system that saw everything before it happened. The roots of this revelation stretch back to 1940, when the United States Navy quietly installed its first shipboard radar, the CXAM, on the USS California. At the time, it was considered experimental, unreliable, even unnecessary by many officers. But by 1942, after the shock of Pearl Harbor and the chaos of early carrier battles, radar became not just useful, it became central to survival. By 1944, every major U.S. warship in the Pacific bristled with antennas. SK for long-range air search, SG for surface tracking, and the revolutionary SM microwave radar that could detect a single aircraft over 100 miles away, even through storm clouds or darkness. This was the world Kenji and his comrades flew into, a world where American destroyers acted not as isolated sentinels, but as nodes in a vast electronic nervous system. From the Combat Information Center deep inside a cruiser or carrier, officers watched green blips crawl across radar scopes, each one representing a plane, a ship, a threat. They calculated speed, altitude, heading. They vectored fighters to intercept. They alerted gun directors to train on incoming targets long before they were visible to the human eye. To the Japanese who still relied on lookouts with binoculars and radio reports from scout planes, this was sorcery. They called it American witchcraft, but it was simply engineering. Born in labs at MIT, refined at Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C., and mass-produced in factories from New Jersey to California. Kenji first encountered this invisible wall during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. He was part of a wave of 370 Japanese aircraft sent to destroy the Fifth Fleet near the Mariana Islands. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese called it a massacre. From his cockpit, Kenji saw none of the chaos the Americans described. What he saw was worse: order, precision. As his formation approached, American Hellcats appeared not from random directions, but from exactly where they needed to be: high, fast, and coordinated. Before his squadron could even sight the carriers, half their planes were gone, shredded by 50 caliber fire. Later in debriefing, survivors whispered that the Americans must have known their flight path in advance. Some blamed traitors, others blamed bad luck. But Kenji suspected something deeper. He remembered how, just before the attack, his radio operator had reported strange static, pulses he couldn't identify. At the time, they dismissed it as interference. Now, he wondered, had the Americans been watching them the entire time?
By late 1944, the evidence was overwhelming. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japanese pilots reported that U.S. ships opened fire before the first Zero even crested the horizon. At Formosa, entire squadrons were intercepted 50 miles from their targets. And over Okinawa in early 1945, the pattern became undeniable. Kamikaze formations were being broken apart before they reached the fleet's outer ring of destroyers. The Americans had built what they called the Big Blue Blanket, a layered defense of radar picket ships, combat air patrols, and anti-aircraft batteries, all linked by voice radio and radar data. The picket destroyers, stationed 50 to 100 miles from the main fleet, acted as early warning sentinels. When radar detected incoming aircraft, they radioed coordinates to command ships, which then scrambled fighters and alerted gun crews. By the time a kamikaze pilot saw the smoke of the fleet, his fate had already been decided. Kenji learned all this not from manuals, he had none, but from the silence of his comrades who never returned, from the reports of those who bailed out and were rescued by Japanese fishing boats, from the grim faces of instructors who no longer spoke of victory, only of delaying the inevitable. Still, he trained. He practiced steep dives, engine management, evasion tactics. He memorized the silhouette of an Essex-class carrier. He told himself that if he could just get close, within 500 meters, his bomb would do its work. But deep down, he knew the truth. The Americans didn't need to shoot him down. They just needed to make him miss. Because by 1945, they had another secret weapon, the proximity fuse. Developed in utmost secrecy, the VT, variable time fuse, used a tiny radar set inside the shell itself. When fired from a 5-inch gun, it would detonate not on impact, but when it sensed a plane nearby, showering the sky with shrapnel in a lethal sphere. Traditional flak required a direct hit. The proximity fuse turned near misses into kills. At the Battle of the Bulge, it had devastated German V-1 rockets over London. In the Pacific, it turned U.S. destroyers into floating fortresses of airburst fire. Kenji had seen its effects firsthand during a mission over Iwo Jima in February. His wingman, Lieutenant Sato, had been flying just 200 meters ahead of him when a shell exploded in midair beside him, not with a sharp crack, but with a deep, rolling thunder. There was no fireball, no smoke trail, just sudden, violent disintegration. One moment Sato was there, the next, only fragments spiraled into the sea. Afterward, Kenji asked his squadron leader what had happened. The older man stared at the horizon for a long time before answering. "They have shells that see us now, too." It was then that Kenji began to understand. America wasn't just fighting with ships and planes. It was fighting with an entire ecosystem of sensing, coordination, and destruction, one that operated faster than human reflexes, beyond human sight, and without mercy for myth. Back in his hut on April 10th, Kenji closed his diary and looked out at the moonlit runway. Tomorrow, he would fly a training sortie. The day after, a final briefing. On the third day, he would take off at dawn, alone, with enough fuel to reach the fleet, but not return. He would not wear a parachute. He would not carry a sidearm. His only weapon was his plane. His only mission was to strike an American carrier. But as he lay down on his thin mat, he thought not of glory, but of radar waves, silent, invisible, sweeping the sky like searchlights from another world. He thought of American sailors in warm compartments below decks, watching green blips move across glass screens, calmly assigning death to dots on a grid. He wondered if they even knew his name, if they cared that he was 21, if they understood that he was doing this for his mother, his emperor, his country. And then he realized it didn't matter, because in their system he was not a person, he was a target, and targets, no matter how brave, do not win wars. The next morning, Kenji flew his training mission without error. He executed a perfect 60-degree dive, pulled up at 800 meters, and returned to base with fuel to spare. His instructors nodded in approval. That night, he wrote one final line in his diary. "If my death cannot reach them, then let my words bear witness. America does not fight with spirit, it fights with sight. And in that sight, we are already dead." 3 days later, at 06:15 hours, Kenji Takahashi took off from Kanoya Airfield in a Zero painted with the rising sun. He climbed to 6,000 meters and turned southeast toward Okinawa. 90 minutes into the flight, his radio crackled, a voice from a picket destroyer speaking in clear, calm English. "Unidentified aircraft bearing 210, range 85 miles. You are being tracked. Turn back or be destroyed." Kenji did not respond. He throttled forward. At 72 miles, American Hellcats intercepted. He lost 2 of his 3 wingmen in the first pass. At 50 miles, the picket destroyers opened fire. Shells burst around him not randomly, but in calculated patterns. Barrages timed to his speed and altitude. He dove, weaved, climbed, but the bursts followed like hounds on a scent. At 25 miles, a proximity-fused shell detonated 15 meters to his port side. The blast tore off part of his left wing. The Zero shuddered violently, but held together. He fought the controls, aiming for the largest ship he could see on the horizon, a gray silhouette with a forest of antennas. He never reached it. At 12 miles, a second shell exploded beneath his fuselage. The cockpit filled with smoke and flame. His last conscious thought was not of his family, not of the Emperor, but of the radar antenna rotating slowly atop the American ship's mast. Calm, relentless, seeing everything. Kenji's plane crashed into the sea 8 miles from the USS Missouri. No bomb detonated, no damage was done. His name was added to the list of 2,500 kamikaze pilots lost in the Okinawa campaign, men who gave their lives in the belief that spirit could overcome steel. But the Americans had already rewritten the rules of war. For them, victory was not a matter of will, but of wavelength. And in that truth lay the final quiet collapse of the Japanese Empire, not with a bang, but with a blip on a screen, fading into static.
The Americans did not win the battle for the skies over Okinawa with courage alone. They won it with a web of invisible eyes, radar stations on islands, antennas on destroyers, microwave beams sweeping the Pacific like searchlights from another dimension. By the spring of 1945, this network had grown so vast, so precise, that it turned the ocean itself into an extension of the American mind. At the heart of this system was a small island just 50 miles west of Okinawa, Shima. Captured in April 1945 after a brutal fight, it was transformed in 72 hours into the most advanced radar outpost in the Pacific. Engineers from the U.S. Army Signal Corps rolled steel matting over coral rock, erected 150-foot towers, and installed the AN-TPS-1B microwave radar, capable of detecting a single aircraft at 120 miles, even through storm clouds or darkness. From this perch, operators could see incoming kamikaze formations before they even left Kyushu. The data flowed instantly to the flagship of the Fifth Fleet, the USS Missouri, where it appeared on a large plotting table in the Combat Information Center. Young officers, many still in their early 20s, moved wooden ship and plane markers with practiced calm, calculating intercept vectors, assigning targets to fighter patrols and anti-aircraft batteries. Nothing was left to chance, nothing was left unseen. This was the reality Kenji and his comrades flew into, a world where American technology had already decided his fate before his wheels left the runway. The system had been built piece by piece, battle by battle. After the shock of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy had poured billions into electronic warfare. By 1943, every destroyer in the Pacific carried at least 2 radar sets. By 1944, carriers operated with dedicated radar picket screens, destroyers stationed 100 miles out, acting as floating early warning stations. And by 1945, over Okinawa, the Americans deployed what they called the Big Blue Blanket, a layered defense so complete it made traditional air attacks obsolete. At its outer edge were the radar picket ships. 17 destroyers and smaller vessels formed a ring around Okinawa, each one bristling with antennas and guns. Their job was simple: see the enemy first, die if necessary, but buy time for the fleet. It was the most dangerous duty in the Navy. Of the 101 ships assigned to picket duty during the Okinawa campaign, 29 were sunk or damaged by kamikazes. The USS Laffey alone survived 22 separate attacks in one afternoon, her decks melting from fire, her radar still spinning. But those ships did not fight alone. Above them, combat air patrols, Hellcats and Corsairs from Essex-class carriers orbited in shifts, ready to dive the moment radar painted a threat. Below, the fleet's anti-aircraft batteries stood ready, their 5-inch guns loaded with the war's most secret weapon, the proximity fuse. Developed in total secrecy by scientists at Johns Hopkins University and the National Bureau of Standards, the VT fuse was a marvel of miniaturization. Inside each shell was a tiny radar transmitter and receiver, powered by a battery the size of a thimble. When fired, it emitted radio waves. If those waves bounced back from a nearby object, a plane, a wing, even a propeller, the fuse detonated, showering the sky with shrapnel in a lethal sphere 20 meters wide. Traditional flak required a direct hit, odds less than 1 in 1,000. The proximity fuse turned near misses into kills. At the Battle of the Bulge, it had shredded German V-1 rockets over London. In the Pacific, it made U.S. destroyers nearly invulnerable to dive attacks. Japanese pilots called it ghost fire. They would see their comrades explode in mid-air with no visible shell impact, no smoke trail, just sudden, violent disintegration. They did not know they were being hunted by shells that could see. The Americans, meanwhile, refined their tactics with chilling efficiency. When radar detected an incoming wave, picket destroyers would radio its bearing, speed, and altitude. Fighters would be vectored to intercept 50 miles out. If any planes broke through, the fleet's inner ring of cruisers and battleships would open fire with proximity-fused shells, creating walls of airburst fire that no pilot could penetrate. By March 1945, the system was so effective that fewer than 15% of kamikaze attacks reached their targets. And of those that did, most caused only minor damage, scratched paint, bent railings, wounded pride. The great carriers, the battleships, the troop transports, they sailed on, untouched, their crews eating dinner while the sky burned above them. This was the truth Kenji and his comrades faced. America had not just built better weapons, it had built a new kind of war, one where victory was decided not in the cockpit, but in the laboratory, the factory, the radar room. The factories were in places like Bloomfield, New Jersey, where Western Electric produced 1,000 proximity fuses a day. In Syracuse, New York, General Electric built radar sets by the thousands. In Washington, D.C., the Naval Research Laboratory tested new frequencies that could see through rain, fog, even the curvature of the Earth. And the men who operated this system were not elite warriors. They were farm boys from Iowa, sons of immigrants from Brooklyn, students from MIT who had never fired a gun. They wore headphones, not medals. They tracked blips, not glory. But they were the ones who turned the Pacific into an American sensor grid. One such man was Petty Officer Second Class Robert Ellis, a 22-year-old from Des Moines, stationed aboard the USS Stret, a destroyer on Radar Picket Station No. 1. On April 6, 1945, the first day of the Kikusui mass Kamikaze offensive, he watched his radar screen light up with over 350 blips. He's watched his radar screen light up with over 350 blips. It looked like a swarm of bees. But we didn't panic. We'd trained for this.
For 8 hours, the Stret fought off wave after wave. Ellis called out vectors to the gunnery officer, who relayed them to the 5-inch mounts. Shells screamed into the sky, detonating with soft thumps that shook the deck. One kamikaze dove at 400 miles per hour, only to vanish in a cloud of shrapnel 300 yards from the ship. Another tried to skim the waves, but the SG surface search radar saw it coming, and the 40mm Bofors guns cut it down before it rose. By nightfall, the Stret had shot down 11 planes. No damage, no casualties. Ellis ate a cold can of beans and wrote in his log, quote, "They keep coming, but they never get through," end quote. Back in Japan, the Imperial Navy knew something was wrong. After the first Kikusui attack, only 28 of 355 planes reached the fleet. Of those, just 9 scored hits, and none sank a major ship. Pilots who returned reported that American defenses were, quote, like a steel net. Their radio silence was broken by desperate, confused transmissions. "I can't see them. They're shooting from everywhere. My wingman just exploded. No shell hit him." Admiral Soimui Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, refused to believe it. He blamed pilot inexperience, poor weather, bad luck. He ordered more attacks. More young men climbed into cockpits with no parachutes, no hope, only the belief that their spirit could overcome American machines. But the machines kept winning. On April 12th, during Kikusui No. 2, Lieutenant Toshio Ota led a flight of 18 Zeros toward the fleet. He was one of Japan's last aces, with 34 kills. He had trained his pilots to fly low, use cloud cover, dive from the sun. But 60 miles out, American Hellcats appeared, vectored by radar from the picket destroyer USS Manert L. Abilene. In minutes, 14 Zeros were gone. Ota pressed on alone. At 30 miles, the Abilene's radar locked on. Its 5-inch guns fired proximity-fused shells. One detonated beneath Ota's plane, tearing off the tail. He crashed into the sea 20 miles from the nearest ship. The Abilene itself would be sunk hours later by an Oka rocket-powered Kamikaze, but not before its radar had saved the fleet. The pattern repeated again and again. Kikusui No. 3, 192 planes launched, 15 reached the fleet. Kikusui No. 4, 126 planes, 8 got through. By May, the success rate was below 5%. The Japanese were running out of planes, pilots, and fuel, but not out of boys willing to die. What they didn't know was that the Americans were listening to them. U.S. Navy linguists aboard ships like the USS Missouri monitored Japanese radio frequencies. They heard the pre-flight prayers, the final goodbyes, the confusion as formations broke apart under radar-guided fire. Sometimes they even heard the moment of impact, static, then silence.
One intercepted message, dated April 16, 1945, read, quote, "We see the fleet, many ships, but their guns fire before we are visible. How do they see us in the clouds? Is this witchcraft?" End quote. The answer was not witchcraft. It was science. It was industry. It was a nation that had turned its universities, its factories, its farms into weapons of perception. And at the center of it all was radar, not as a tool, but as a philosophy. The American way of war was not to guess, not to hope, not to rely on spirit. It was to know, to see, to calculate, to act. This was the lesson the kamikaze pilots learned too late. Their sacrifice was not met with chaos, but with order, not with fear, but with calm precision, not with blind courage, but with a system so advanced it made heroism irrelevant. By June 1945, even the most fanatical instructors in Japan admitted the truth. In a secret meeting at Kanoya Airfield, Major General Kiyoshi Hayashi told his pilots, quote, "The Americans do not fight as we do. They do not wait for you to come to them. They see you before you take off. They kill you before you see their ships. Your death will not change this." End quote. Some pilots wept, others burned their flight logs, a few refused to fly, but most still climbed into their planes not because they believed in victory, but because they had nowhere else to go. The war was already over. They just hadn't been told. And the reason they hadn't been told was because the Americans didn't need to say it. The radar said it for them, every second, every mile, every blip on a green screen. In the end, the kamikaze campaign failed not because the pilots lacked courage, but because courage could not overcome a system that saw everything before it happened. America had not just built a shield, it had built a new kind of battlefield, one where the first shot was fired before the enemy even knew they were in range. And in that battlefield, even death could not reach U.S. ships.
The war ended not with a final battle, but with silence. In the weeks after Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, American occupation forces began the quiet work of gathering testimony from those who had flown the last missions of the empire. Among them were the few kamikaze pilots who had survived, not by choice, but by failure. Engine trouble, weather, missed targets, broken wings. They had returned at airfields in disgrace, expecting execution or exile. Instead, they found American interrogators with notebooks, cigarettes, and questions. What the Americans wanted was not confession, but understanding. How had Japan come to this? What did the pilots believe? And most importantly, what had they seen? The answers, recorded in hundreds of pages of U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey interviews, revealed a truth more devastating than any battlefield loss. The kamikaze campaign had failed not because of cowardice or poor tactics, but because American technology had already rendered spiritual sacrifice obsolete. One of the first to speak was Lieutenant Tetsuo Yamada, a 23-year-old from Osaka who had been forced to abort his mission on May 11, 1945, when his Zero's engine seized 40 miles from the fleet. He spent 3 days adrift in a life raft before being picked up by a U.S. destroyer. For months, he refused to talk, but in October 1945, sitting in a repurposed classroom at Atsugi Airfield, he finally wrote a statement that would become one of the most cited accounts of the kamikaze experience. "We were taught that the American sailor was soft, that his ships were fragile, that his spirit would break under the purity of our sacrifice. But from the sky, I saw something else. Their fleet did not panic. Their guns did not fire wildly. They waited. They tracked us. They killed us before we knew we were seen.
I do not believe they even feared us. To them, we were not divine warriors, we were targets, and targets do not win wars. Yamada's words were echoed by dozens of others. Ensign Kenji Sato, who bailed out after his plane was shredded by proximity-fused fire, described watching his comrades explode in midair with no visible shell impact. He wrote, "It was as if the sky itself turned against us. We called it ghost fire. We did not know shells could see." Perhaps the most haunting testimony came from Petty Officer First Class Hiroshi Tanaka, a radar operator on board the cruiser Yahagi, which escorted the battleship Yamato on its final mission in April 1945. Tanaka survived the sinking and spent months in a POW camp in Okinawa. In his debriefing, he described watching American radar picket ships detect the Yamato's approach 180 miles out before the Japanese fleet had even left the inland sea. Tanaka said, "Our admiral believed we were hidden by weather, by distance, by fate. But the Americans saw us from the moment we sailed. They knew our speed, our course, our composition. They sent 386 aircraft to meet us, not because they guessed, because they knew. When the bombs began to fall, I understood. Japan was not fighting an enemy. We were fighting a system. And systems do not bleed. They calculate." This realization that America fought not with men alone, but with an integrated web of sensing, coordination, and destruction, was the final psychological blow to Japan's military elite. In secret meetings held in Tokyo in the summer of 1945, senior officers admitted what they had long suspected: the kamikaze was a myth sold to boys to mask the empire's technological collapse. Admiral Jisaburoro Ozawa, commander of the combined fleet, told his staff in July, "We send children to die because we have no fuel, no planes, no radar. We call it Spirit. But Spirit cannot shoot down a Hellcat. Spirit cannot stop a proximity fuse. Spirit is what you have when you have nothing else." Yet the boys kept coming. In villages across Kyushu and Shikoku, young men volunteered in droves, believing their deaths would save their families, their emperor, their nation. They wrote poems, they shaved their heads, they kissed their mothers goodbye, and they climbed into cockpits knowing they would not return. What they did not know was that the Americans were listening, not just to their radio calls, but to their very souls. U.S. Navy linguists on board ships like the USS Missouri and USS Tennessee monitored Japanese frequencies with growing sorrow. They heard the pre-flight prayers, the final messages to parents, the confused cries as formations broke apart under radar-guided fire. One intercepted transmission, dated April 12, 1945, ended with a pilot whispering, "Mother, I cannot see the fleet, but their guns are firing. How do they see me?" The Americans had no answer. Only silence. After the war, many of these linguists would say the hardest part was not the violence, but the intimacy. "We knew their names," recalled Lieutenant James Chen, a Nisei interpreter from Los Angeles. "We heard them cry for their mothers, and then we watched our guns erase them from the sky. It was not hatred, it was duty, but it left a mark." That mark was felt most deeply by the survivors, the pilots who lived when they were meant to die. In the years that followed, many struggled with what they called the shame of survival. They had been trained to believe that only death had meaning. Yet in American captivity, they encountered something unexpected: mercy. At POW camps in Okinawa and the Philippines, former kamikaze pilots were given medical care, food, and space to grieve. American doctors treated their burns and shrapnel wounds without judgment. Chaplains offered quiet words, not lectures. And slowly, in the silence of recovery, the myth began to crack. One such man was Lieutenant Masao Ito, who had been pulled from the sea after his plane was hit 10 miles from the USS Bunker Hill. He spent 6 weeks in a U.S. Navy hospital where a young medic from Kansas named Robert Hayes changed his life.
Every day, he brought me water,
Ito later recalled. He spoke no Japanese, I spoke no English. But he smiled. He showed me photos of his family. He treated me like a man, not a monster. One day, I asked through an interpreter why he was kind to me. He said, "Because you're human, and my job is to save humans." Ito wept. For the first time, he understood. America did not fight Japan because it hated Japanese people. It fought because it believed in something worth defending. This revelation spread quietly among the survivors. In camp discussion groups organized by U.S. Army psychological warfare units, former pilots began to speak openly about their doubts. They questioned the propaganda they had been fed. They admitted that they had seen American abundance in newsreels, factories, farms, cities untouched by war, and wondered if victory had ever been possible. By 1947, many had become vocal critics of militarism. Ito himself wrote a memoir titled "The Sky That Saw Us," in which he argued that Japan's true enemy had not been America, but its own refusal to see the modern world. "We built planes with wood and fabric, while America built them with aluminum and radar. We trained boys to die, while America trained men to live. We worshipped death. They worshipped life. And in the end, life won." This transformation was not unique to pilots. Across occupied Japan, a generation of soldiers, sailors, and civilians began to rebuild their nation on new foundations: democracy, industry, peace, inspired in part by what they had seen of America, even through the lens of defeat. The U.S. occupation, led by General Douglas MacArthur, accelerated this shift, but it was not imposed by force. It was accepted because the Japanese people had already seen the alternative and chosen it. In classrooms, factories, and farms, the lessons of the war took root. Engineers studied American radar manuals. Farmers adopted U.S. agricultural methods. Students learned English, not as the language of the enemy, but as the language of the future. And at the heart of this new Japan was a quiet acknowledgement. America's victory had not been a fluke. It had been inevitable. Not because Americans were braver, not because they were more numerous, but because they had built a society that could see, adapt, and create, while Japan had built one that could only sacrifice and obey. The final proof came in the skies over Korea just 5 years later. In 1950, when North Korean forces invaded the South, Japan, once the empire that dreamed of Asian domination, became America's ally. Its ports refueled U.S. carriers. Its factories repaired American jets. Its people cheered for the same democracy they had once tried to destroy. Among those watching the newsreels of F-86 Sabres dogfighting over the Yalu River was an aging Lieutenant Tetsuo Yamada. Now a high school teacher in Kyoto, he showed the footage to his students and said, "This is what happens when a nation chooses life over death." The boys in his classroom did not know about kamikaze missions. They did not know about radar picket ships or proximity fuses, but they knew this: Japan would never again send its children to die for a myth. And in that knowledge lay the true end of the war. For the kamikaze pilots, the final irony was this: their sacrifice had not saved Japan, but their failure had. By proving that spirit alone could not overcome science, they had helped shatter the ideology that had led Japan to ruin. Their deaths were tragic, but their legacy was redemption.
Today, at the Chirin Peace Museum for Kamikaze Pilots in Kagoshima Prefecture, visitors can see the final letters, poems, and diaries of the 1,036 young men who flew from that airfield in 1945. Among them is a single line written by a 19-year-old named Akira Shimizu. "If my death means nothing, let my words mean something. Tell the world that even death could not reach the American fleet, because America saw us coming." The museum does not glorify war. It mourns it. And in that mourning, it honors a deeper truth. The greatest victories are not those that destroy enemies, but those that transform them. America did not just defeat the kamikaze. It made them obsolete, not with more courage, but with more clarity, not with more planes, but with more perception, not with hatred, but with a system so advanced, so humane, so confident in its own values that it could afford to let its enemies see the truth and live to tell it. In the end, the radar did more than track planes. It exposed a lie. And in that exposure, it helped build a peace that has lasted for generations. The Pacific is quiet now. The blips on the screens have faded. But the lesson remains. In war, as in life, the side that sees first wins.